This is a season when our thoughts turn to celebrations with our friends and family.
Something happened behind palace walls that wasn't meant to reach the public at least not like this. In the middle of the night, while most of the country slept, King Charles III reportedly approved an emergency action, so rare that many constitutional experts believed it was practically obsolete. No announcement, no press conference. Just a quiet move that immediately set off alarm bells inside both the palace and Parliament. And according to reports, it all began with a discovery that forced a question no monarchy ever once asked. What? If the line of succession itself had been quietly tampered with, what makes this moment so unsettling is how ordinary it supposedly started. Reports claimed the discovery happened during routine archival work, the kind meant to preserve history, not rewrite it. But buried among old files was a sealed collection that didn't match its label. Documents that seemed intentionally set aside rather than forgotten. As they were reviewed, a pattern allegedly emerged: language that hinted at managing outcomes, correcting trajectories, and preventing situations from becoming problematic. On their own, those phrases sound harmless. Together, they raised serious red flags, and the deeper the documents were examined, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about dusty history. According to accounts circulating among royal watchers, the concern wasn't embarrassment, it was legitimacy. The British monarchy survives on one core idea, that succession follows the law, not preference, influence, or behind-the-scenes maneuvering. These papers reportedly suggested the opposite, that senior insiders may have quietly nudged events, shaped perceptions, and steered decisions over years, possibly decades. Nothing dramatic on the surface, no sudden removals, just subtle pressure, selective information, and quiet guidance that could alter outcomes without ever triggering a public crisis. And that's exactly why it's so alarming. Faced with this, Charles was said to have had two options: keep everything contained, investigate privately, and hope nothing leaked, or act fast, formally, and visibly even if it meant igniting a constitutional firestorm. Reports suggest he chose the second path. The emergency order he allegedly signed wasn't symbolic. It triggered immediate lockdowns of sensitive archives, restricted access to records spanning generations, and authorized an independent inquiry with sweeping authority. This wasn't about damage control. It was about stopping something that might still be ongoing. That's where the story takes a darker turn. The documents reportedly weren't limited to the distant past. Some references pointed to activity, far more recent than anyone expected, implying that knowledge of the original scheme hadn't vanished with time. Instead, it may have been preserved, maintained, and quietly managed. There's been buzz suggesting that certain individuals understood exactly where the most sensitive material was stored and why it needed to stay hidden. If true, that would mean the issue wasn't just historical misconduct, but an active effort to protect it. Rumors also suggest resistance began almost immediately after the emergency measures were triggered. Systems reportedly failed. Records temporarily became inaccessible. Former officials were suddenly unavailable. None of this has been officially confirmed, but the timing raised eyebrows. It painted a picture of people scrambling not to explain what happened, but to control how much could still be uncovered, and that urgency only reinforced the fear that the truth, once fully exposed, could be far more damaging than anyone anticipated. The most unsettling question is the one people are now whispering rather than saying out loud: does this affect today's line of succession? Not because current heirs did anything wrong, there's no suggestion of that, but because legitimacy depends on an unbroken lawful chain. If earlier links in that chain were quietly altered, even indirectly, the entire structure rests on shaky ground. Some experts argue that time and parliamentary approval have settled the matter. Others say legitimacy doesn't expire just because a secret stayed hidden long enough. Inside Parliament, the reaction has reportedly been tense. There's no clear playbook for a situation like this. Ignoring it risks validating manipulation. Digging too deep risks destabilizing an institution already under pressure. And hovering over every discussion is the same reality. Once public trust is questioned, it's almost impossible to fully restore. The monarchy doesn't rule by force. It survives by belief, and belief is fragile. What happens next depends on how far the investigation goes and how much actually comes out. There's a scenario where the inquiry concludes that, despite troubling behavior, nothing ultimately changed the course of succession. That outcome would still demand reforms, but it might spare the monarchy its worst fears. There's another scenario, far more unsettling, where subtle interference is proven to have shaped outcomes in ways that can't simply be brushed aside, that would force decisions no modern monarch has ever faced. What's clear is that this isn't just about old papers or internal politics. It's about whether power was exercised without accountability, whether systems meant to protect democracy were quietly bypassed, and whether transparency can arrive decades too late. By authorizing an unprecedented response, Charles may have opened a door that can't be closed again. And once the full story is known, whatever it turns out to be, the monarchy and the country may never look at succession the same way again. Behind the scenes, the investigation reportedly shifted from cautious review to an all-out race against time. What began as an effort to understand the past quickly turned into a scramble to protect the present. Sources familiar with the situation claim investigators realized that evidence wasn't just sitting quietly in archives, it was vulnerable. Digital records, personal correspondence, and administrative files from previous decades were scattered across institutions, some protected, others alarmingly exposed. And once the emergency order went into effect, it became clear that not everyone welcomed scrutiny. Whispers began circulating about unusual activity almost immediately. Systems that had functioned normally for years reportedly experienced sudden technical issues. Certain files required restoration from backups. A handful of former insiders, people expected to clarify key moments, were suddenly difficult to reach. None of this has been formally confirmed, but the pattern was enough to raise concern among those leading the inquiry. To them, it suggested panic. Not confusion panic, the kind that only appears when people fear what might still be uncovered. What makes this especially troubling is the suggestion that silence wasn't just passive. Reports claim there were deliberate efforts, even recently, to manage risk and control exposure. Language found in later materials allegedly focused on maintaining continuity and avoiding reinterpretation. On the surface, those phrases sound administrative, but in context, investigators reportedly viewed them as signs of an ongoing strategy to keep certain narratives intact, regardless of what the historical record actually showed. That means the cover-up outlived the original actions by decades. As the scope widened, the investigation reportedly began pulling in more than just palace staff. Government departments, legal advisors, and outside institutions were quietly asked to produce records. The implication was unsettling. If manipulation happened, it didn't happen in isolation. It required cooperation, or at least silence, from people far beyond the royal household. That's when concerns shifted from royal scandal to establishment-wide accountability. This was no longer about protecting a family's image. It was about whether democratic safeguards had been bypassed by people who believed they knew better. Public reaction, though limited by careful disclosures, has already shown cracks forming. Polling conducted after early reports began circulating suggested a divided response. Some people expressed outrage at the idea that unelected insiders could interfere with something as fundamental as succession. Others focused on the response itself, arguing that confronting the issue openly, even at great risk, was the only way forward. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: the idea that the truth might still be hidden is far more damaging than whatever that truth turns out to be. Inside the royal family, the tension is said to be deeply personal. Heirs were reportedly briefed not as participants, but as people whose futures might be shaped by decisions made long before they were born. That uncertainty weighs heavily. Imagine being raised for a role your entire life, only to be told that forces beyond your control might complicate it. There's no accusation attached to them, only the uncomfortable reality that legitimacy depends on systems they didn't design and couldn't challenge. Some constitutional experts believe this moment could become a turning point rather than a breaking point. They argue that sunlight, even decades late, is better than silence. That institutions survive not by pretending to be flawless, but by proving they can correct themselves. Others are far less optimistic. They warn that once people begin questioning the foundation of authority, it's nearly impossible to rebuild trust completely, especially among younger generations who already feel disconnected from inherited power structures. What's almost certain is that reform is coming, regardless of the investigation's final conclusions. Oversight mechanisms that once relied on tradition and discretion are now being questioned. Transparency, once treated as optional, is increasingly seen as essential. The era of unquestioned deference behind closed doors appears to be ending, and that alone marks a historic shift in how the monarchy operates. The real question isn't just what happened or who knew, it's whether institutions built on history can survive confronting it honestly. The emergency order didn't provide answers, it forced questions into the open. Questions about power, accountability, and whether legitimacy can truly exist without transparency. Whatever the investigation reveals, one thing is already clear. The story of succession is no longer just about the future. It's about reckoning with the past and deciding whether truth, once uncovered, can still hold everything together. As the investigation presses forward, the pressure surrounding it continues to intensify. Every new interview, every recovered document, and every verified timeline adds weight to a process that many insiders reportedly never expected to happen at all. What was once protected by silence and assumption is now being dissected under formal scrutiny. And that shift alone has altered the balance of power inside institutions that once operated largely unchecked. People who spent careers believing certain questions would never be asked are now being required to answer them on record. And under oath, one of the most uncomfortable realities emerging from this process is how easily systems built on trust can be exploited. When oversight is weak, the monarchy, by design, relies heavily on tradition, discretion, and loyalty. Those qualities can be strengths, but they can also become vulnerabilities. If investigators ultimately confirm that a small circle of insiders was able to influence outcomes simply by controlling information, timing, and access, it would expose a structural flaw that extends far beyond one period or one group of people. It would show how power can quietly accumulate in spaces where transparency is assumed rather than enforced. There is also growing concern about what happens after the investigation concludes. Even a thorough inquiry can't rewind history. It can't undo relationships that were discouraged, decisions that were nudged, or perceptions that were shaped decades ago. At best, it can clarify what happened and determine whether corrective action is necessary now. But clarity alone doesn't guarantee closure. For many people watching closely, this process isn't just about accountability, it's about reassurance that the system going forward will be different from the one that allowed this to happen in the first place. That's why discussions about reform are no longer hypothetical. Legal scholars and constitutional commentators have begun openly debating whether informal conventions are enough to govern an institution with such symbolic and constitutional weight. Some argue that clearer rules, written standards, and independent oversight are overdue. Others worry that formalizing too much could strip the monarchy of the flexibility that has helped it adapt over centuries. But even those voices tend to agree on one point: returning to the old way of doing things is no longer an option. Public patience is another factor that can't be ignored. Information is being released slowly, carefully, and often without detail. While that approach may be necessary for legal reasons, it also creates a vacuum, one that speculation naturally fills. Every delay fuels suspicion. Every unanswered question invites another theory. The longer uncertainty lingers, the harder it becomes to separate confirmed facts from rumor, and the greater the risk that confidence erodes before conclusions are reached. For the monarchy, this creates a delicate balancing act. Move too fast, and you risk mistakes that undermine credibility. Move too slowly, and you risk appearing evasive. The emergency order may have demonstrated decisiveness, but sustaining public trust will require consistency and follow-through. People will be watching not just what is uncovered, but how it is handled, who is held responsible, and whether meaningful change actually follows. Ultimately, this moment is about more than one investigation or one set of documents. It's about whether an institution defined by continuity can confront disruption without collapsing under it. History shows that the monarchy has survived wars, abdications, scandals, and sweeping social change. But survival has always depended on adaptation. The question now is whether adaptation can include full transparency about uncomfortable truths and whether doing so strengthens legitimacy or exposes how fragile it really is. Whatever the final findings reveal, the precedent has already been set. Secrets once buried have been brought into the light. Assumptions once left unchallenged are now under examination. And a conversation that was never supposed to happen is unfolding in real time. The outcome will shape not only how succession is understood, but how authority itself is defined in the modern era. And once that conversation reaches its conclusion, there will be no returning to the illusion that everything was always exactly as it seemed. As this unfolds, one reality is becoming impossible to ignore. The investigation has already changed the monarchy, regardless of how it ends, even if the most severe suspicions fail to hold up under scrutiny. The mere fact that such questions can now be asked openly marks a turning point. For decades, authority within the royal system flowed quietly through tradition and assumption. Now, that authority is being examined, documented, and tested against modern expectations of accountability. There's also a growing awareness that this moment will be studied far beyond Britain. Constitutional monarchies around the world are watching closely, not because their systems are identical, but because they rely on similar foundations of trust, continuity, and legitimacy. If one of the world's oldest monarchies can be shaken by hidden influence rather than open revolt, it forces a broader conversation about how power is preserved and who is allowed to shape it behind closed doors. The implications stretch well beyond palace walls. Inside the investigation, patience is reportedly wearing thin. Every new lead seems to raise more questions than it answers. What began as a contained inquiry into a specific cache of documents has reportedly expanded into a sprawling examination of institutional behavior. Patterns matter now more than individual actions. Investigators are said to be looking not just at what was done, but at how it was possible for it to continue without challenge. That shift in focus could prove more consequential than any single revelation. What complicates matters further is that accountability doesn't operate on a clean timeline. Many of the people who may have set events in motion are no longer alive. Others have long since stepped away from public roles. That raises difficult questions about responsibility and consequence. Is exposure enough when punishment is no longer possible? Or does the absence of accountability only deepen public frustration? These are questions with no easy answers, and yet they sit at the center of the debate. At the same time, expectations are evolving. Younger generations are far less willing to accept "that's how it's always been done" as justification. They expect explanations, transparency, and mechanisms that prevent abuse of influence. For them, legitimacy isn't inherited, it's earned. And institutions that fail to recognize that shift risk becoming symbols of a past that no longer resonates with the present. The monarchy now finds itself navigating a narrow path. On one side lies defensiveness and retreat, a strategy that might limit immediate fallout but deepen long-term mistrust. On the other lies openness, reform, and the willingness to accept uncomfortable conclusions. The emergency order signaled a choice, but choices must be reinforced by action. People will judge not by statements, but by outcomes. What happens next will likely define this era of the monarchy more than any ceremony or celebration. The findings of the investigation, the reforms that follow, and the accountability or lack of it will shape how authority is perceived for years to come. This is no longer just a question of who inherits the crown. It's about whether institutions rooted in history can prove they belong in the future. And as the inquiry continues, one thing remains clear. Whatever truths emerge, they won't simply fade away. Once legitimacy is questioned, it demands an answer. Silence is no longer an option. The story is still unfolding, and its conclusion will leave a mark not just on the monarchy, but on how power itself is understood in a modern democracy.